Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Wraithmarked. It's been around 2 weeks since the second Joker movie opened in theaters, and in that time, it has become a pretty unprecedented disaster. After a dismal opening weekend and a very steep drop in week 2 where it made less than the low-budget horror sequel Terrifier 3 in the US, it's become a pretty shocking flop for Warner Brothers. I think in the month or so before it released, it became clear from the box office tracking that the film wasn't going to open anywhere near as big as the first. But almost no one, or at least no one in the film industry, seemed to believe it would crash and burn this hard. I think it's easy to look at this one movie in isolation, because there are a lot of things about this situation that are very unique to it. Todd Phillips' extremely large budget, the choice to make it a musical, etc. But I think things get even more interesting when you place it in the larger context of DC's track record with sequels, especially recently. The more you look into it, the more a pattern seems to emerge. A trend that Warner and DC can't seem to just stop repeating, and that's what I want to get into this week. Before I do though, I want to mention that I've definitely seen an uptick in videos being demonetized these last couple weeks, which tends to hurt videos in the algorithm, so I definitely appreciate a like on this one to make sure it gets out to as many people as possible.
Sorry, gentlemen, but my Joker plane is here. Tell Batman.
The more you look at DC and Warner's track record with sequels lately, the worse it gets. Obviously, the old adage that the sequel is never as good as the original is often true. But in the age of IP, that line has only become blurrier. I mean, The Dark Knight, the sequel to Batman Begins, and technically the 8th theatrically released Batman movie, is often held as the gold standard when it comes to the character and superhero movies in general. We know good and even great sequels are very possible, even if they are fairly rare. But when you look at what's been done with DC's pretty well-received slate of hits after 2019 or so, it's been one disastrous sequel after another. There's been a lot of talk of Joker 2, I did that last week, but it does feel worth lingering on just how crazy that budget is. Obviously, if the movie was great, or honestly, if it was just more of a spectacle, I wouldn't care about this talking point too much. But having seen the movie, it just feels wild. Like, the first Joker was a relatively low-budget film by blockbuster standards, costing around $60 million to make and grossing over $1 billion worldwide. This one, according to some reports, is like $200 million. Obviously, it was always going to be a much bigger budget than the first, that's just how sequels to hits go, but these Joker movies are fairly small and intimate, lots of cramped rooms, long hallways, and not much in the way of action. I won't spend too long on this because honestly it's kind of a tangent, but seriously, like, what happened here? But in terms of what went wrong with these sequels, I think it all kicked off with Wonder Woman 1984. I think it's easy to forget now just how incredibly well received that first Wonder Woman was in 2017. At the box office, but also it was treated like a genuinely great movie. Websites were speculating that it could net itself a Best Picture nomination, and I don't just mean like geek culture websites, but industry sites like Hollywood Reporter. James Cameron saying he didn't like the movie was greeted with scorn and derision. And look, I enjoy the movie, apart from its really tepid third act, but I get the sense that its reputation has kind of diminished over time. And maybe the reception of Wonder Woman 1984 is the biggest reason why. Now, I'm not even talking about the box office or anything. 2020 was the worst possible year for a big movie to come out. Most people watched it on HBO Max. None of that was the film's fault. But I really think people were primed to love this one. It had been a long, rough year, most big movies had been delayed, and here was a brand new sequel being dropped on an app that the whole family could watch for a fairly affordable price. If it had just been okay, I really think Wonder Woman 84 would have been greeted very warmly. Such a baffling misfire in so many ways that it failed to make much of an impact at all, except maybe stopping the excitement around Gal Gadot's take on this character dead in its tracks, no matter how many cameos she'd do in later DC movies. I will say, of all the sequels I'm talking about here, I do think Wonder Woman 1984 still might take the cake as the worst one. I'm sure many will disagree, especially with Joker so fresh in their minds, but for me, it was really that big of a disappointment. Now, one narrative that I saw a lot of in the comments section of my Joker review is the idea that this is proof that the director is beginning to get too much power, with Todd Phillips steering the project off a cliff thanks to his demands for an inflated budget and his control over the script. And many could say similar things for Wonder Woman 2. But I think it would be wrong and more than a little depressing to act like DC just needs to rein in their directors more, and shouldn't let them do anything the studio isn't 100% sure will fly with audiences. Because that's definitely not the issue with Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. Now, I actually liked the first Aquaman quite a bit. I think probably more than your average person. I remember a lot of comments being baffled by how much I enjoyed that one. But the sequel was so clearly reshot over and over again, and overhauled in post-production to square with DC's bigger universe plans, that it came out the other end wildly uneven, and a lot less enjoyable than it should have been, considering how much I like some of its Silver Age comics-inspired look and feel. Similarly, Shazam! Fury of the Gods is not exactly an auteur-driven piece of cinema. It's a very, very brand-safe, tepid movie that tries and fails to recapture the light charm of the first. And that was pitched right down the middle. It did almost nothing to stand out, beyond a few horror-inspired touches. So obviously, it's not failing to take a heavy hand with production that's making all these DC sequels bad. There's examples of these films going wrong in a number of different ways. So why are so many of DC's sequels falling flat when their predecessors were pretty well received? There are a few things that I think really contribute to it. First, it's just much trickier with the tone. DC has always struggled with maintaining a consistent tone across its films, and for the record, I think that can be a really good thing. One sequel I haven't mentioned here, because I do view it as more of a full-on reboot, is The Suicide Squad, which is wildly different in tone than Joker, which is obviously different in tone than Man of Steel. That's something I've actually respected quite a bit about DC through the years. But that does mean that pulling off the cinematic universe was always going to be much harder. The MCU, at least for a time, succeeded in creating a semi-cohesive world where everyone from Rocket Raccoon to Black Widow could feel like they belong in the same movie. DC, both on purpose and maybe a little accidentally, has taken a more fragmented approach. Each film feels like it's trying to be its own thing. That was less the case with Snyder's, where he had kind of his own Snyder tone, but even his third movie was ripped out of his hands and given a totally different tone. And I think this has been noticeable at times in their sequels too, like Wonder Woman 1984 was a real departure from the more grounded, earnest feel of the first Wonder Woman. And Joker 2 is obviously an even larger departure. I don't think that has to be a bad thing. Sometimes it can be great, like how the Evil Dead films have managed to switch tones and highlight or downplay its humor and camp throughout the years. But DC has not been handling it well. But I think the biggest factor here is the constant shift in leadership and vision at Warner Brothers and DC. Over the past decade, DC has felt like a revolving door of leadership. When there's no clear, long-term vision for these characters and stories, it's hard to maintain the momentum from one film to the next. With James Gunn at the helm, that could change. DC Studios has gone out of its way to make clear that the Joker 2 wasn't really on them, or especially Gunn, and that it was handled by Warner proper, but I do think this still makes his job harder, because it's not like the general public is really paying attention to any of that. To them, Joker 2 is just DC putting out a bad sequel again. And with the downturn of the superhero genre and how many misfires have come out of both DC and Marvel the last few years, I think it's going to be really hard for him to regain that trust. I love Superman, and I'm cheering for this new one to turn the page on this era of DC and usher in something exciting and fresh. But I'm especially interested to see the next steps, and if DC will ever be able to make a worthwhile sequel that actually lives up to the potential of its first entry. Chris Nolan made it look easy. All these years later, we know it's definitely not. But it's a problem they absolutely need to solve. Because without the ability to make a great follow-up, the concept of an interconnected universe doesn't work. The idea that this time it'll take is just pure fantasy. Speaking of fantasy, if you're a fan of cozy fantasy or beautiful looking books, I have a really exciting one for you. Wraithmark's incredible new edition of Travis Baldrey's Bookshops and Bone Dust. Now, of course, this was a sequel to 2022's Legends and Lattes, maybe the defining novel of the cozy fantasy genre and a New York Times #1 bestseller. And what Wraithmark does is create these amazing custom-made deluxe edition of books like this. They sent me the one they did for Legends and Lattes last year, and it's really something to behold. They took a beloved novel and made a truly unique and exciting edition, and they're doing it again with Bookshops and Bone Dust on Kickstarter. Now, both have been done in collaboration with Travis. Every single copy has been signed by him, with a custom cover from artist Justin Gerard. And that's just the start. We're talking about embossing and contrast glossing on the jacket, custom sketchwork on the hardcover case, gold page gilding, and an included ribbon bookmark. Not to mention a completely customized interior layout, 2 full-color end sheets, and a bunch of wood carving style scene and character illustrations, also from Gerard. They've just done so much to make this deluxe edition really stand out. It's a great way to express your love for these books, or experience them in the best possible way for the first time. And if that's you, you can pick up the first book on Kickstarter too, saving on shipping and having 2 great looking novels headed your way. So go to the Kickstarter link in the description or pinned comment below and get this truly deluxe edition of Bookshops and Bone Dust.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.